Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. We've got our all-star team of former speechwriters to talk about the Democratic National Convention. So with me this afternoon is Lance Izumi, Senior Director of Education and Chief Speechwriter to Governor Duke Duke-Majan and Attorney General Ed Meese, and Tim Anaya, Speechwriter to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and other top California legislators. And I'm Rowena Itchon. I'm COO, and I was speechwriter to Governor Pete Wilson and was a research assistant on President Reagan's speechwriting team. So let's start with the first question. The Democratic Convention convened this year was under unusual circumstances with a late change in the presidential ticket. So let's start with our review of the Democratic Convention with the big speech from the big guy himself, President Joe Biden. And as one of the most unpopular presidents in recent memory, do we think that his convention speech helped or hurt the Democratic cause? Well, I'll start first. I really got the feeling, I don't know about you, I really got the feeling that this speech was actually his acceptance speech, and with a few tweaks and a sprinkle of Kamala. I mean, it didn't seem like an appropriate speech for an outgoing president. I certainly would have written it differently. I would have written something more reflective of his presidency, optimism for the future, more of a statesman-like address. But once again, he was old, angry Joe, yelling at the crowd, scolding, the audience, some audience out there. I don't know why. These are all his, loving fans. And even, I have to say, in the opening of his speech, even when he said, "I love you," I wasn't sure whether he was talking about his family or the party faithful out there, but the way he said it, it was actually kind of scary that he was like coming after you. It was a little weird. And I had to say all of those thousands of "I love you, Joe" banners were over the top and made the whole thing kind of contrived, all designed to make him feel good. But overall, I think he did the best he could in terms of his delivery. And still, if I were a reporter, I would absolutely have to go back to the transcript to double check what he said. So many of his words and sentences were slurred and garbled. And, I think most Americans would look fondly at an elderly man with, his speech impediment, speech issues. But for the President of the United States not to be understood clearly and to have an evening like him as he did, well, I think most in the audience, Democrats, were thinking quietly to themselves, yeah, we made a good decision. Lance, what do you think?
I think that it really didn't hurt or help the Democrats, because I actually think no one cared. I mean, I think at this point, just irrelevant. He left the convention, didn't really make an appearance after that first night, and Kamala Harris really barely mentioned him in her speech. And so, I think that, regardless of what was in his speech, it really didn't matter. And I think that it was, maybe appropriate in a certain sense that the Democrats actually cut James Taylor singing "You've Got a Friend" to introduce Biden, and they cut that because he was the convention was running long and they needed that time for Biden to get up there to give his speech. But I think that really sums up everything. Biden really doesn't have any real friends, and I think that the shot of some of the people who were basically conspirators in terms of getting him out of the race, like Nancy Pelosi and those others. I think that when we have friends like those, who needs enemies? What do you think, Tim?
Well, you couldn't really help but feel for Joe watching the big speech, which, I think it might have been a metaphor that it took place way past 11 o'clock in the East. He clearly overstayed his welcome and didn't know when to get off the stage. And I think they did that on purpose. I don't think it was just disorganized. I think they did that on purpose because they were afraid of what he would say or how he might look. And, when you saw him there, as Rose said, it was obvious he has regressed. And, he really couldn't run a presidential campaign or serve 4 more years, and kind of made me wonder, well, why are you still president today? But that's another matter. Yes, the DNC, the Biden we saw at the DNC, it was the State of the Union Biden. He was yelling and screaming and ranting, and he obviously had 20 cups of coffee before his speech. And, it was used to the Biden. It was the Biden we've become used to in the coming era in the recent months, right? The slurring and the stumbling and, the delusional part where he compares himself like he's a modern day FDR. What I thought was interesting was that he obviously bears no ill will toward Harris in his being pushed off the stage, because he certainly gave her a full-throated endorsement, and I think it was sincere. And when they were yelling, thank you, Joe, he actually told the crowd, no, thank you, Kamala. And he gave her credit for a lot of things in his administration, a lot more than she took credit for herself. Now, you could take that both ways, because it's great fodder for Republican tack ads tying Harris to Biden. But overall, I thought it was a sad farewell for Joe. And adding insult to injury, right? You had Nancy Pelosi, who really played the key role in giving Joe the shiv, sitting in the front row, hugging a thank you, Joe sign, and he couldn't help but see her during the entire speech. And then you had all these delegates, many of whom called for his withdrawal, doing all this chanting, thank you. That really had to chap his hide. But I would say going forward, presidents usually give kind of a major farewell address. Sometimes it's a series of farewell addresses, and they usually do it in rather august places or even in the Oval Office. And I would hope that the Biden team is planning something like that, however difficult it is for him to give a big speech, because, I think a president, however bad their record, deserves to go out with dignity. And I just didn't think it was a very dignified send-off for Joe from the party. And I thought that whole spectacle Monday night, it was kind of rubbing his nose in the indignity.
Yeah, well, let's now turn to Kamala Harris. So in her past national campaigns, she hadn't really had a good track record as a good speech maker or even a good candidate. Her acceptance speech was her big chance to reintroduce herself to the American people and show that she's up to the job for president. So what's our takeaway from the Harris speech? What do we think? What grade do you think we should give her? So I can start first. So like Biden, I think she had a pretty low bar to jump over. She didn't seem giggly and silly and unsure of herself as she has in the last 3.5 years. So when she's not that way, it's a victory, frankly. And I would say that she did accomplish that. Her delivery was good. She had a very elegant and presidential look, I would say. I thought she opened well with her personal story, a daughter of immigrants, growing up with activist parents in the civil rights movement, a feminist mother. The rest of her speech, however, I think it was really badly written. It was full of cliches, every cliche you could imagine. It's sort of like, her speechwriters took all the conventional feel-good lines and strung them all together. I don't even really remember any great lines from her speech, but as I said, I don't think it really matters. She delivered her speech well. I'd give her an A. She was charming. She's got that dazzling smile. She checked all of the progressive proposal boxes. It went well overall, but I'd give her speech writers a D or an F. Lance?
Well, I agree with a lot of what you said, Ro. I thought the first part of her speech where she talked about her kind of autobiography, her growing up, what her family life was. She talked especially about her mother and really kind of presented herself and introduced herself again to the American people, at least in a personal way. And I think that, politicians, when they do that in a sincere way, at least when and it comes across sincerely, I think that does resonate with people when they hear that. And I thought that that was an effective part of her speech, probably the most effective part of her speech. Of course, she didn't, mention a lot of people who were involved in her earlier life, like Willie Brown, but we won't get into that. But I thought that, I agree with you too, that I believe the speech was very well delivered. I predicted when Tim and I were talking previously before this speech was given that I thought that she would deliver deliver it well because, she can read a teleprompter and she can read it well, and she did a good job. I thought that it was energetic, and the emphases were just right. So so on that part, I would give her a high grade on that. I think the second part of the speech, which was when it came to policy and her agenda, there was really no there. That was the problem. There was little policy specifics. What policy specifics there were basically kind of retreads of the Biden administration record, and there really wasn't anything really new. I mean, you just look at the her proposal, so-called, on inflation. I mean, she basically said that we should get together labor and business and entrepreneurs and workers and bring them all together to bring down prices. Well, how's that a policy? I mean, does she really think that that type of generality is going to get inflation down? How's that going to work when it comes to energy prices and all these other types of prices that have skyrocketed through the entirety of the Biden-Harris administration? And so, I think that if you're a serious listener and viewer, and you're watching this, I think you're at first impressed by her. But then when it comes to all the policy that you want to hear about, whether it's inflation, whether it's immigration, or whether it's crime, or any of these other issues that people are really interested in because they're affecting their lives, and they want to hear Harris say something that it will give them hope that things will change for the better if she is elected in November, I didn't think she delivered the deal for them. I don't think that she gave them something to be confident about, that things will change. And she's trying to walk a tightrope because she wants to both defend her record in the Biden administration, but then also say that things will get better. And I just don't think she closed that deal, because she was so general and lacked such specifics that I don't think that if you were listening and hoping for that message, that came through. And I don't think that that for a lot of undecided people, that they would say that, well, for sure, I'm going to be voting for her. And so therefore, I think that if you look at the first part and the second part of her speech, I give her a C. Tim, what do you think?
Well, Ann says Kamala Harris would say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I think we forgot to say at the beginning of our taping, just like at the DNC, there's a rumor that I can't confirm that there'll be a special celebrity guest coming on later in our podcast. So stay tuned. Can't confirm or deny it. But, I agree with you both. I had to actually watch the Harris speech twice. And last night when I watched it kind of in the moment, I actually thought it was kind of underwhelming. And especially if you look at it as the convention as a whole, there was a lot of build up to the speech and all these celebrities and everyone, with all that build up, her speech really didn't meet the moment, as Gavin Newsom might say. But then when I watched it again this morning and I had time to reflect, I think it actually was a pretty effective speech for her, and I'd probably give her a B+ overall. And, yes, we know she's not a terrific speech maker, but as she showed, she can give a very polished speech. And I thought she did that. They played into her strengths as someone who's overcome a lot and is relatable and likable. And she talked about all the experience of her immigrant mom and waiting for the Mayflower moving van and living in the flats of Oakland. And, kind of watching the speech, I would say, well, hey, that's someone who I'd be friends with and have a glass of wine with and, hang out with her from time to time. But electing her as president is a far different matter. But I think why it was so effective was Americans generally elect the presidential candidate they like the most. Just remember back in 2000, Al Gore was by far the most experienced. He had dozens of detailed positions on every issue. He was preferred by voters on virtually every issue. But voters elected George W. Bush because they liked the guy. They saw him as someone they'd have over for a barbecue or go to a game with. And I think that was obviously Harris's strategy. And, based on her convention speech, I think she largely succeeded on that front. Join PRI on Saturday, September 21st at the Four Seasons Hotel Silicon Valley in East Palo Alto for our annual Sir Anthony Fisher Dinner, featuring this year's keynote speaker and Toby Family Freedom Prize recipient Kimberly Strassel. You read her Potomac Watch column every week in the Wall Street Journal. You see her on TV in her regular appearances on Fox News Channel. And you read her best-selling books like The Biden Malaise. Now, come see her in person at a terrific evening supporting PRI. She'll discuss the 2024 election, what's going on in our nation's capital today, and the fundamental importance of civil liberties. Visit pacificresearch.org/events today to buy your tickets. While you're there, you can learn about sponsorship opportunities. We hope to see you on Saturday, September 21st. Tickets are selling fast, so visit pacificresearch.org/events today to secure your spot.
Well, as we know, vice presidents have a challenge coming onto their own when running for president, especially when they're, in this case, when they're trying to shed the albatross of her predecessor's unpopular policies. So with the late passing of the baton in this case, how well do we think Kamala Harris established herself on her own 2 feet as a presidential nominee in the speech? Well, I'm looking at it from the Democrat audience, and I think simply the contrast of old and young carry the day, that she could actually get across the room without stumbling, without looking lost, with focus and intention. I think that was enough to establish herself apart from Biden. Moreover, I think that given all of the bad press that she's received over the last few years, that she's a lightweight, that she's got turmoil in her staff, that she was picked for the votes that she can get. I think that gave people an overall sense, at least did for me, that she was kind of marginalized by the Biden administration, that she was a bit player. So even though she shares all of Biden's progressive ideas, she wasn't actually part of its execution. And even though these results are bad from these policies, it's almost as if the Democrats are saying, well, it's a new day, we can start again, and this time it'll be different with Kamala. Lance?
Well, I think that Kamala was, really put in a difficult situation in terms of this passing of the baton, because she had to, contort herself into a political pretzel, because she's actually part of this administration. It'd be one thing if she were a U.S. senator, for example, and she wasn't part of the administration, although of the same party. When she said that, I want to chart a new way forward. Well, if you're not part of the administration, then it's easier to say that and say that even though we're part of the Democratic Party, I am going to, chart a new way. But that's not, what she has to deal with. She was part of that administration. And if you want to chart a new way forward, well, the question is, what was wrong with the old way? And if you want to chart a new way forward, what are those new things that you want to do that are different from what you've been doing for the past 3.5 years with Joe Biden? And if that again underscores, when she goes to the policy part of her speech, then you want to hear, okay, let's hear what you're going to do different, that is different from what Biden has done. And as I said previously in the podcast, that I don't think that she did. She didn't really say anything. She didn't say anything about a lot of the issues, but when she did say things about issues, they were basically kind of recaps of the Biden-Harris administration record, and just basically kind of doing the same stuff. And people are still dissatisfied with that. And again, I just think that if you want to chart a new way forward, you got to give people some new ideas, a new hope. That their lives are going to be different because of new policies. And I just don't think that she delivered on that. And so I think that this speech was, as I said, delivered well, but it's in essence a very sugary thing, which is going to dissipate because there was no there. Tim, what do you think?
Well, other than the kind of pro forma platitudes at the beginning thanking Joe and Jill, she basically ignored Biden or the fact that she was the incumbent vice president. She talked a lot in the kind of biographical part of the speech about her experiences as a prosecutor and as Attorney General of California. But then it kind of seemed to end, and the story changed to how she's going to prosecute the case against Trump. And really, the only mentions of her work as vice president involved Ukraine and Gaza and that bipartisan immigration bill. So I think it's both things. I think she, as vice presidents usually are, they're kind of aced out of an administration. And I think they wanted to, avoid that albatross from being hung around her neck. And it really was interesting to see, Lance, you're right. She's effectively trying to stake her claim as being like the challenger in the race, that she's turning the corner from the status quo. Now, whether the American people will buy that is another matter. But again, this is, one of the failings that we've had in this campaign so far, that she hasn't submitted to tough questions from an independent journalist. She hasn't gone through a debate yet. Now, she will hopefully have to answer those tough questions eventually. But, last night the media was really cheerleaders if you flipped around any channel, and they weren't certainly acting the role that journalists should play. So I think that's a tall one that people aren't going to buy, but we will see.
So let's move on to the next question. So a lot's been made about Vice President Harris's abrupt shifting of positions from more liberal positions on issues like single payer healthcare and trying to rewrite history of as the Biden administration's borders are. So how convincing do we think she was in her speech in trying to change the subject from her past political liabilities? So I'll just go back to my comment on the last question. I think she was considered a bit player by the media, or it's sort of get that sense that she was not a major player in this administration. And while she shares a lot of the flawed policy ideas of this administration, she wasn't part of the implementation. So I think, at least in the Democrats' eyes, it's a new day. We've got someone young and fresh and maybe not necessarily new ideas, but ideas that she's got going to have the energy to have a clean start and the force to make things happen. Obviously, GOP voters aren't going to buy any of this, but for the undecideds, which is what we're really talking about here, when you do look at the polls, what matters to them most? And I've looked at data on the undecideds, and number one is inflation. The other one is number two is the border crisis, and three is this kind of whole idea of fairness. I think has something to do with kind of the woke issues. So clearly the border crisis, she's directly responsible there. She was the border czar. Inflation, well, she cast the deciding vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, which only made inflation worse. And in terms of this idea of fairness, it's pretty clear that she was not exactly the merit candidate. Her presidential campaign imploded faster than anyone else would have imagined. So for the undecideds, I think I think it's going to take more than this speech and this convention to get them on her side. I think they still need a lot more convincing. Lance?
Yeah, well, I don't think she was successful at all in terms of turning away the subject from her past political liabilities. I mean, I've mentioned the immigration issue. Now, she did mention immigration one time during her speech, but it was really not to talk about her history as the Biden-Harris administration's border czar, but it was just to talk about the immigration bill from earlier this year, where she was beating up on Trump for supposedly stopping this bill in Congress, and that she claimed that that this would have done great things to secure the border. Well, the thing of it is that even if that bill had passed, it wouldn't have done anything about the millions and millions of illegal aliens who have entered this country in the 3.5 years of the Biden-Harris administration. Ro, you talked about the fact that a great percentage of people name immigration as one of their key issues, especially amongst undecided people. Well, that immigration bill she talked about in her speech would have not done anything about all the dysfunction that's occurring in so many places across the United States because of illegal immigration. And so, for her to try and pivot to just that bill and ignore her record or lack of record and basically failure as the border czar for the Biden administration, I think is just not going to wash with people. They're going to see the fact that their lives, the quality of their lives has gone down because of the lack of action on the part of the administration on border and immigration issues. And, they're not going to be blaming Trump for that. She's the one who was in charge. And, when the Republicans, start really unleashing on her and what's going on in the cities in terms of crime, government handouts, all the things that are really upsetting people about the immigration crisis. I think that a lot of those undecideds are going to end up going away from her because she did not explain herself as to why she should be entrusted with 4 years in the future when the past 3.5 years have been such a record of failure. So anyway, Tim, what do you think?
Well, I would say that overall, she just didn't talk about any of these issues. And it kind of went along with the light on policy theme. Now, on the immigration bill, I think that is a fair conversation to have and a fair policy debate to have with Trump since his opposition did tank the bill. Now, she talked briefly, aside from immigration, about some of the things that she wants to see policy-wise going forward, primarily contrasting her values with those of Trump's. And I think that's probably the best way she can deal with these issues. If you have kind of a checkered past to overcome, well, put out your own plans and kind of, plant your flag in the ground about the direction you want to see on policy going forward. It kind of enables you to run on the issues you want to run on and try to set the debate in a way that's most favorable to you. But again, the question is whether the American people will buy that. But that's certainly a preview of kind of the direction she's going from her speech. But, again, at the end of the day, it's up to journalists to hold her accountable for her past positions and flip-flopping and ask the tough questions. And it's up to the debate moderators to bring these issues up during the debate. And, as we've seen this week from most of them, they're more interested in being cheerleaders than, tough independent journalists.
So let's move on to the voters. And as we know, once again, the election is going to be decided by working class and middle class voters in the Midwest and the Sun Belt. So, right before the convention and also in her speech, Harris rolled out a host of largely big government policy items that were designed to win over these swing voters. So how effective do we think she did in appealing to the interests of these Americans? Well, I tend to think that the damage is done, and it's going to be tough to convince voters that even with all the money she wants to give away, that the Harris agenda could even begin to mitigate the condition of the working class and the middle class. I think that Americans, working class and middle class Americans, still remember the better days in the Trump administration where their incomes were growing and they were prospering. It was a safer America, and that's just not long ago. It was just 8-10 years ago. But President Trump has to do his part to really drive this home. He's really got to discipline himself and stay on message, and he needs to be able to connect the dots for Americans. Lance?
Yeah, well, I think that, despite the centrist rhetoric at the convention, in Harris's speech, I mean, she tried to accentuate, kind of bipartisan efforts and, unifying themes. You look at her economic policies, I mean, they're some of the most left-wing proposals of any recent Democrat nominee. I mean, Democrats are often vilifying businesses, but to openly call, for example, in her economic package for price controls, it's just shocking. And we know that price controls, whether it's in the US during the 1970s or in the communist Soviet Union, caused shortages and a lot of suffering. And who suffered? It was the working class, the people who can least afford the pain of shortages and not being able to buy the goods and and afford the services that they need. And I think that when you look at what Harris campaign has put forward, I mean, I think that This again, it's just these easy government handout efforts to try to basically buy votes from the working class, whether it's through subsidizing first home purchases or price controls. But I think that, one of the things that people will understand is that, there's not enough supply. That's one of the problems for example, when it comes to housing. Homes aren't being built fast enough so that you can push down the prices. And so what is the Harris campaign and Harris herself going to do about increasing the amount of whether it's housing or energy or whatever in order to reduce the prices? And you'd hear nothing from Harris or the campaign about that. It's all just more relying on government spending, relying upon government regulation, and to try and fix an economy that they've really torpedoed. And I just don't think that in the end the American people are going to buy it because it's not going to be effective. Tim, what do you think?
Well, I think her speech was effective, as we said earlier, as far as relatability. The experiences she talked about living in the flats and always moving and living in a one-bedroom apartment. Those are the experiences a lot of working class people in the Midwest and Sun Belt have had. On policy, as we've said, she didn't really offer anything other than platitudes. But she didn't really say anything much about policy at all in her speech. I do think what might also be appealing, and we haven't mentioned this yet, is all the talk, both in Harris's speech and throughout the convention, about freedom and patriotism. Now, the Democrats have kind of a different definition of freedom, as that video that played before Oprah's speech showed. It's kind of wrapped into, big government initiatives. But the USA chants and the flag waving and the talk of patriotism, I think that is going to be well received because we know, voters in the battleground states, they are very patriotic. And so I think that, even though it's not really a substantive issue, I think that will be well received, however cynical the staging of that may have been. We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
So there's an elephant in the room at a Democratic convention where elephants actually aren't allowed. And of course, that's immigration. So in poll after poll, the American people have said that they overwhelmingly oppose the Biden administration's immigration policies. So in your view, Lance and Tim, was Harris able to move beyond these big problems for Democrats on immigration in her speech? I'll just say a few words. I mean, we talked about that she glossed over the immigration issue in a couple of paragraphs, mentioning that border security bill and of course blamed Trump for killing it. I think their policy here is just avoid talking about immigration and try to pivot, pick some, or either that or pick some time frame, which I think they've been doing lately, and offer some good statistics, even though clearly these statistics are bogus. If you see night after night, the issues happening on the border. I think the Democrats have no choice but to dodge this issue and changing it and pivoting to some issue like abortion or Trump's conduct is, I think, the way they're going to handle it. And that's why it's important for Trump to keep hammering at these issues instead of straying off to January 6th or all the litigation that he's been through. That's not going to win him votes. Lance?
Yeah, well, I don't think that the Democrats and Harris and Walz can move beyond this issue by simply not talking about it or glossing over it. Because, I mean, the reality is the fact, as I've said previously in the podcast, is that there are millions of illegal aliens who have entered this country, and they're causing a lot of dysfunction for a lot of people in this country. And if Harris and Walz gloss over it, that's not going to alleviate the problem that people are currently feeling right now. And when Harris said that she would want to, have a pathway for citizenship for illegal aliens, I mean, I just don't think at this current time politically that that's where the American people are. I mean, they're seeing millions and millions of these illegal immigrants coming across the border with basically nothing done, and causing services to in their cities and states to be backed up, and the taxpayers holding the bill for it. And I think they're very upset about it, and they're not in the mood to hear about pathways to citizenship for these people who they believe have broken the law by coming here in the first place. And I think that Trump made a brilliant move to have a counter event at the border where he had angel moms talking about the horror of having their children raped and killed by illegal alien criminals. I watched the testimony at the press conference by Patty Moran, who talked about her daughter Rachel Moran, the mother of five, who was raped and killed allegedly by an illegal alien, and it was incredibly moving. And so, even if the Democrats and Harris and Walz want to try and avoid the issue and talk about other things like abortion or whatever, certainly the Republicans and the Trump campaign are not going to allow them to do that. And I think that that is going to resonate with the American people because, as you point out, Ro, it's one of their top issues that they're concerned about this election year. Tim, what do you think?
That's exactly right. And remember that, all the polls in the most recent poll showed that voters by a double-digit margin trust Trump more than Harris on immigration. And so while we've talked about earlier, the bipartisan immigration bill, gives her a talking point, I don't think it's going to be very effective in overcoming the voters' dim view of her agenda and her past actions and leadership on the issue of immigration. I think that's one of the things where, not answering for her past, she really did a kind of a disservice. Now, again, hopefully an independent journalist or debate moderator is going to put these tough questions to her and we'll see how she will handle it. But, really for last night, she just tried to say her piece and get out of Dodge.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only way to do it because how can you make better what's happened? There's no way of improving it. There's no spin for this, and I think all she can really do is just dodge it.
Well,
So,
I want to just say that
yeah,
Harris may want to run away from the immigration issue, but she can't hide from her record.
that's right. So let's talk about her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. So the Governor Walz was largely unknown to most people when he was tapped to serve on the ticket. So how effectively uh, do you think he did in his speech in both introducing himself and showing his capabilities of being a heartbeat away from the presidency? Well, I would have to say that I didn't agree with anything he said in terms of policy in his speech, but he seemed like a likable guy. He had this folksy, genuine manner. His speech, I certainly didn't hurt him. And as governor, he's actually probably more capable and competent at running government and delivering on his policy proposals than Kamala Harris. I do think he does add to the ticket, as a Midwestern, down-to-earth guy standing with Kamala Harris, who is a San Francisco Democrat with Hollywood and all the coastal glitterati beside her, behind her. Presidential candidates don't want their vice presidents outshining them. And Kamala Harris picked a guy who matched her progressive agenda and was even she was a backbencher and he's a backbencher to a backbencher. So in terms of, in retrospect, it's probably not a bad idea to have chosen him for the ticket. What do you think, Lance?
Well, I think that his speech at the Democratic National Convention, first of all, was thankfully brief. It was 17 minutes or so long, so I didn't have to sit through too much of it. But I have to say and give him credit. He's a good, energetic speaker. I agree with you, Ro. I mean, he delivered his speech well. I mean, whatever policy was in there, I mean, I didn't agree with a lot of it, but he did deliver the speech well. The fact of it is, though, I mean, he is one of the most left-wing governors in the country, but he tried to portray himself as a moderate, and he said that he was, when he was governor, he worked across the aisle on issues like veterans and the rural economy. He supported the Second Amendment and was tough on crime, and so, if you were just, if you knew nothing about the guy, I mean, he would seem like he was coming across as a moderate. But, the man has a very clear record of left-wing priorities and not just that, of a lot of failure. I mean, of course, he's not necessarily going to talk about the weaknesses in his governorship and his political career, but I mean, he's got some huge glaring weaknesses, such as the failure during the George Floyd riots when Minneapolis burned to the ground and you had $500 million of damage in Minneapolis the mayor of Minneapolis, who was a liberal Democrat, asked him, the governor, Tim Walz, to send in the National Guard, and he dilly-dallied for days before sending in the National Guard. And by that time, it was too late in many cases. So, I think that failure is, I mean, when we talked in a previous question about an elephant in the room, well, that's a huge elephant in the room. When you have $500 million worth of damage in your biggest city going on, and you just dance around it and saying that, hey, I was a coach of a football team when I was in high school, when I taught high school. And then, you have the controversy around his military service record, which I don't think is going to go away. The New York Times even said that, hey, that the problems of overstatement by Walz with regard to his military record is certainly worthy of criticism. And so, if you have the New York Times who is saying that, I think that it's going to be a problem for the Harris campaign going forward. And then certainly you can count on the Trump campaign to hammer Walz on these issues. And so, while I think that his speech was a good speech, I think that it's not going to inoculate him on on those those weaknesses in his armor going forward. Tim, what do you think?
Like the Harris speech, I think he did a very good job of showing himself to be a relatable guy, a good person, someone who's had a lot of the same life experiences as particularly Midwestern working class voters have. He didn't come across as the sort of weird, bouncy guy that has been the caricature of him painted by the Republicans since he was named to the ticket. I think perhaps the most poignant moment of the whole convention was when his son, who suffers from a learning disability, pointed at his father and said, "That's my dad." And, their family, that experience, having a son with special needs and their family story about infertility treatment, that's something a lot of families have had to experience. As with Harris, he certainly took jabs at Vance and some of the weird things that Vance has said on the campaign trail so far. And, on policy, he also was light on policy, but he kind of positioned himself as a champion of the middle class, and Trump and Vance as being for the rich. But, he like with Harris, he really tried to gloss over his record or policy at all. So I think that the jury's still out on that point. But again, the Democrat strategy is likability and relatability, and I think he scored very high on both counts. To me, he kind of came across as your liberal high school teacher that you actually still really like, even though he's a leftist. And watching him, though, it's going to be a very entertaining vice presidential debate. And I think you have two people who couldn't be more different on policy or style. So I think it's going to be fun to watch this kind of clash of ideas and visions.
Okay, so honorable mention time. So there were many other speakers, ranging from politicos to regular people taking the stage in Chicago. So which one of the other speakers, a couple of other speakers on the convention stage that you think were particularly noteworthy and why? I didn't, I'm not going to mention any single speaker, but I noticed, and Tim, you and I talked about this, about how they really had a lot of star power in terms of popular culture. They had Oprah, they had Stevie Wonder, they had a lot of musicians, singers that would appeal to a younger generation and generate a lot of excitement, not only from the attendees at the convention, but also got a lot of play in the media, the stars, and I'm sure it brought in viewers who wouldn't normally be watching the convention. So in terms of as far as the vibe, I'd have to give it to the Democrats, who seem more in touch, more hip, more forward looking, and you kind of contrast that to the GOP convention, which had the usual politicos and some country western singers and Hulk Hogan. And I see these guys as, they're from the past. So I would have to give it to the Dems for glitz and glam and excitement. What about you, Lance?
Well, I actually think that I mean the fact that Beyonce, who was rumored to be a surprise guest at the Democratic National Convention, which Tim mentioned earlier in the podcast, but she was ended up being a no-show. I actually think that that's kind of almost like a metaphor for the impact of Hollywood, because I don't think that, despite the fact that Hollywood virtually in its entirety is pro-democratic, Kamala Harris, that's really going to make any difference. Yes, the Democrats can roll out all the glitz and everything like that, but Hollywood has been anti-Republican, anti-Trump for years, and what difference has that really made? I mean, nightly excoriations from the late night talk show hosts, from Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Kimmel and others, who are just piling on Donald Trump every night. And has that really done anything to cause half the country to abandon their belief in Trump? No. So I think that it's the Democrats rely upon this star power, which they do have, but does it in the end give them any more firepower or any more leverage amongst working class people who, in those states like, Michigan or Wisconsin or wherever? I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that, having Oprah Winfrey there is going to change the view of, steel workers in the Rust Belt, because I don't think that they're relatable to begin with. And I don't think that that those people who are in those demographics who are being fought over by both parties, are, see Hollywood celebrities as representing them or having the same problems that they have, and they just can't relate to them in that way. They enjoy their entertainment, the songs or the sports or whatever, that makes them famous. But when it comes to telling them how to vote, those people know that those celebrities are not experiencing the pain and the problems that they are. And so I think that, in the end, I think the Democrats bark up the wrong tree with that. Tim, what do you think?
Well, I disagree, Lance. I think there was only one speaker who mattered at this convention, and it was Oprah. Say what you will about her, but she still has that same Oprah magic all these years later. I mean, remember in 2008, she legitimized Barack Obama. She traveled the country for him, and I would argue she was largely responsible for him getting the nomination. Now, housewives in all across party lines, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, in all these battleground states listen to Oprah. And I think her coming out for Harris was a very powerful endorsement. Her speech, I thought, was also very effective. And Oprah can be good or bad in making speeches. But I think especially the tone she took, it was an appeal to unity. It was an embrace of freedom. It was an appeal, as she said, she's a self-declared independent, to move beyond this kind of rotten partisanship we've been stuck in recent years. I thought that her the picture she painted of, you don't ask your neighbor's race or religion when their house is on fire. You do the best we can to try to save them. That's exactly right. And I think nearly everyone who watched feels the same way. It was an appeal to optimism and inclusion and character and common sense that I think is going to resonate very well with the key voters in these states. And those key voters in these states aren't who Land said it is. It's the double negatives. It's the Republican-leaning voters, many of whom are women in these battleground states who didn't like Trump or Biden. And I think Harris may have just scooped up quite a few of those voters thanks to Oprah. We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
So let's close with a 30,000-foot question. Looking at the Harris speech and the convention overall, how good a job do you think the Democrats did rhetorically in setting themselves up to prosecute the case against the Trump and Vance ticket this fall? Well, I didn't hear any soaring rhetoric about the future, about economic opportunity. There was no Morning in America speech. I did hear a lot of poking fun of Trump, the MAGA movement, conservatives. It was all pretty tiresome. I think the Democrat convention was more like a big party because, frankly, they were on a train headed over a cliff, and they managed to get back on the rails with a new ticket. And they are ecstatic that they could live on. So I think the convention was more about that. It was one big giant relief party. Now that's over, and the real work has to begin. Harris has got to get through the debate, and at some point she'll have to do some real interviews with tough reporters. And I think at this point, voters will be reminded why even this failed administration couldn't take her seriously. Lance?
Well, when I think about the Democratic National Convention, I'm reminded of that line from Shakespeare's Macbeth, sound and fury signifying nothing. All of the accusations against Donald Trump have been made a gazillion times already, and look at it right now. I mean, they've had little effect on Trump. He's the Republican nominee. He's still in a position that he could still win this election. So, if that's all they've got, and if you listen to the speeches, where Trump's name is mentioned, umpteen times, versus anything about real policies for the future, if that's all they've got, then I believe the Democrats are really setting themselves up for a disappointment in the November because, they're counting on something that just may not be there for them. Tim, what do you think?
Well, overall, I think it was a very successful convention. The programming was much more appealing and relatable than the GOP convention. As Roe mentioned, you can't compete when you've got Oprah and Stevie Wonder and John Legend and Pink and even Luke Skywalker, and the Republicans are offering you Lee Greenwood and Hulk Hogan. I just think there's real enthusiasm there. I could see if you're a run-of-the-mill voter watching at home, yeah, these are people you want to join up with more than the Republicans they saw on TV. Now, for their kind of key framing of the race, that likability versus negativity and the future versus the past and unity versus division, I think they did a very good job on all of those points. And to be fair, Trump hasn't exactly helped his own cause in recent weeks since Harris has been named as the nominee. But now, as Rose says, comes the tough part. Can she hold her own on policy? Can she answer tough questions from reporters? Can she account for her flip-flops? Can she answer for the borders or criticism? Can she look like a president on the debate stage? That's all on Harris. But this convention, in my view, set her up pretty well on that path.
Well, thanks, Lance and Tim, and to our audiences for listening. And until next time, which will be the presidential debate. Bye. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.